I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and this is the Elysian Acoustic Labs Pilgrim. There's your cheat sheet, it's the Pilgrim. This is the new IEM from Elysian Acoustic Labs, and if you've never heard of them, it's not because they're a new brand. They've been around for a while, but it's probably because you're not typically shopping for IEMs in the price range they typically make. Elysian is a boutique brand. They typically sell stuff that's like $1,000 plus, $3,000 plus. Yeah, I'm not kidding. Thankfully, the Pilgrim is not that expensive. In fact, it's just 400 bucks, which I know is not super cheap, but compared to all the other stuff they've released, this is definitely coming in much lower than their other stuff and much lower than I expected. In fact, I heard this thing at CanJam a couple of months ago, and at the time I was pretty impressed with it, and I thought it was 600 bucks. So for this thing to actually come out in retail now at 400 bucks, frankly, I'm pretty impressed. Now, on that note of having heard this thing at CanJam a couple of months ago, if I'm perfectly honest, I was more impressed with it then than I am now. And I think they've kind of nerfed this IEM, and that's kind of one of the things I want to talk about in this review. In fact, let me go to my notes. So when I demo IEMs for the first time, a lot of times I write listening notes like this for myself. They're not super detailed, but they're enough for me to remember what I was hearing, what I thought about it at the time. And this is what I thought about the Pilgrim back in March 10, 2024, CanJam, New York. Break for Lovers is the first track I listened to. I cite track titles that I listen to, and these are like track titles I use for almost all the songs I listen to. But Break for Lovers, I say it's got a nice balance. The treble and the upper mids are maybe a little bit present, but not uncomfortably. The bass is sturdy and deep, but not rich. And for me, those are kind of like euphemisms to say it's not mid-bassy, it's more sub-bassy. Transparency on vocals is strong. Close Down, which is a song by The Cure, I say the bass is a little bit light and flat sounding, but that's also true because it's not so mid-bassy. But the tune works well for the congestion. That track kind of has a lot of congestion in it, so the tune was working well for that. And now here's where I get into the things that I really remember about the Pilgrim, is that it's plucky and light. Okay, sorry, let me go back. Transients, specifically on the song called Stop Waiting. It's a song by Cigarettes After Sex with these just really delightful guitar transients and strums and stuff. See, the transients are fantastic, plucky and light, versus the Dusk, which was my favorite thing that I heard at CanJam. The treble transients here on the Pilgrim are even more delicate and exact. Vocal resolution, maybe not quite there, but I really was impressed with the transients on the treble. The Games of Luck, it's a song by the Parcels, and specifically I listened to the live version. So the hi-hats are perfect in timbre and level, Hyphaman-esque, okay? So those were the things that I thought about this IEM when I heard it a couple of months ago, and I was really looking forward to the production version of it. But again, I think it's been nerfed a little bit. And we'll talk about why, but I guess I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So I guess a quick shout out to Hi-Fi Go for sending this guy in for review. If you want to check out the Pilgrim, I've got it linked down below. But let's just talk about what you get inside the box, the physical form factor on this IEM, what it sounds like, and how it compares to some other IEMs at around this $400 price range. Because honestly, it's a market that's it's heating up in a good way. I'm excited about it. So packaging. Nice box. I dig it. It says Pilgrim on the outside. You're not going to forget what it's called. The carry case that it comes with, pretty typical. Yeah, a little bit large for my taste, and it's nicely built. Over here, these are not that typical, and they might not look that interesting to you, but these are actually SpinFit tips. These are official SpinFit tips that have a black core. I've never seen these before. And that, again, might not be that interesting to you, but I know a lot of people like SpinFit ear tips, and if you want these black ones, I don't think they're available except for buying a $400 Pilgrim. But otherwise, let's talk about the IEM itself and the cable that it comes on. Let me move this stuff out a little bit more so I've got room to spread out this cable. And I think it is generally a really nice cable, really nice. And I guess some of that I would expect because Elysian typically does really nice cables with their IEMs. They don't really spare any expense here with their $400 Pilgrim. Now, I will say it's a little bit memory prone, you can kind of see, but generally the behavior on this guy I am quite into. Aesthetically, I think it's well done. It's a little bit, it's only 2 cores, but they are thicker than your average 2-core cable, and because of that, it just gives it like this nice plushiness without being overly thick and cumbersome. I dig it. The Y-split you get is nicely sized, not too large. You get a chin cinch, which actually stays in place. I appreciate that. And then of course you've got your pre-curved ear hooks, which are I think tastefully done. Now, one thing that's unique about this cable, and this is actually probably my least favorite part about this cable, is the connector. So this is actually using a Pentacon connector, which is not your standard MMCX, you're not your standard 2-pin connector. It's a unique type of connector. Now, it's not unique to Elysian. It is not like a proprietary connector. There are other IEMs with this connector, mostly again, kind of in the boutique range. But personally, I don't know. It's like it connects nicely, right? It just kind of snaps in, kind of like an MMCX, but not quite as stiff, not as hard. And then supposedly it's more durable. I don't know. I've never really had a problem with MMCX personally, but it does also rotate like an MMCX, which is personally not my favorite. I like the 2-pin holds them in place, but that probably does give you more range of motion in terms of fitting with your ear. The only beef that I really have with this connector is just that I don't have other cables like this. So if this cable for whatever reason goes bad, I'm gonna have to go out and buy another cable, specifically one that has Pentacon, or yeah, the Pentacon connector on it, rather than whatever cables I happen to have in my collection. And maybe that's just a me problem because I got so many cables. But I do also like to just like swap cables and like find the cable that fits an IEM the best, not necessarily for sound. In fact, not at all for sound, but just to, you know, find something that works well with it aesthetically as well as handling wise. Now, the good thing is that I don't really feel any need to swap cables here on the Pilgrim. I think this cable is a fantastic match for it, but I don't know. I actually wouldn't mind maybe even trying this cable on another IEM. But I don't have any other IEMs that use this connector, so I can't. So yeah, I don't know. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a thing. I'll just say that. The shells themselves. All right, let's talk about the IEMs. They are a metal construction, as you can probably tell because it's glossy. And you can kind of see that it is machined in two different finishes here. There's like a matte finish as well as a glossy finish. Now, what you might not be able to tell until I switch over here to the side, that it's actually kind of like a tiered milling. So it's not perfectly flat, and it actually just it's a nice construction. A little bit more complex than your average IEM, especially, you know, even at this price range. So nice build quality. The shell shape itself is somewhat on the generic universal shape, which is in line, honestly, with what Elysian typically does. Even on their more pricey IEMs, they're not into the overly molded semi-custom designs. A lot of their IEMs fit more like this, which is a little bit more universal. I guess I'll put it in my head as I'm talking about this, but maybe a little bit less secure. Now that said, that's the wrong camera. I didn't really have any issues with the fit security on this guy. It was generally a pretty good fitting IEM, as you can see. Size-wise, I would say that this is a medium fitting IEM. It's certainly not large and, you know, not small or anything like that, but I find this thing to be perfectly comfortable. Again, fit stability on it is actually better than I expected, if I'm honest. You know, again, I'm kind of, my preferred fit is that more semi-custom molded style with like a, you know, something that catches on to little anti-tragus here, the little ear nubbins. And it doesn't really have that, but I don't know, it doesn't actually seem to be lacking much. And you see it also doesn't really stick out my ear that significantly. So generally, I don't have any serious complaints about the fit on this guy. I guess I will highlight briefly that I'm not using the stock tips, even though they're really cool black spin fits that I've never seen before. But I had these lying around, and these actually just kind of extend the nozzle just a little bit, and that for me helped out with the fit stability. Okay, so I think that's enough talking about the physical form factor. Let's get into talking about the sound, because that is what has changed here versus the CanJam version. But before we talk about what's changed, let's talk about what is. And I will pull up the frequency response on SquigLink, which I've got linked down below if you want to check this out for yourself. But this is the frequency response of the Pilgrim. And this is, you can see it versus my target versus the Harman target. This is what I would describe as a nice, well-balanced tune. It is more or less mid-range focus. It does have some sub-bass emphasis here, but this little bass boost here, it's all below 150 hertz. So honestly, like a lot of music, like I mentioned in my listening notes, Closed Down by The Cure, a lot of the bass in that is not really in the sub-bass frequency. So because of that, this sounds actually kind of bass light on certain stuff. But when you've got music that's got it tuned in there, I think it's well balanced. It does come across maybe a little bit lean in the mid-range, but you can see here in the top end, it is not overly forward. I would say that to my ear, it does sound maybe a little bit brighter, a little bit more open sounding, versus in the frequency response, it's like kind of teetering on the edge of like it could be a little bit warm and reserved, but I think in listening experience, it's very well balanced. That's how I would describe the tuning. They did a really good job with that aspect of it. Now, that said, when it comes to my listening impressions, again, I feel like it doesn't quite live up to what I remember of it at CanJam. It's a good sounding IM. I would say the imaging on this thing is solid, not stand out really in any way. The bass quality is about what I remember it being, but that delicateness, that quality, that transparency on the transients is not quite there. And especially the thing that I miss is that weightiness in the high frequency percussion, the hi-hats and stuff that I was hearing in Games of Luck. It was, I think, a special sound. Like, again, maybe it was a little bit over aggressive, and I guess here, let me pull up and show you what the difference is, all right? So this red line is what it graphed like at CanJam, and you can see that down low, like it pretty much the same tune. It really is just here on the top end where the CanJam version was a little bit more forward, a little bit more aggressive, to be honest, and probably a little bit less safe. In fact, from what I understand, they had got some feedback that it was a little bit on the bright side. And I can understand why they got that feedback. But to my ear, it was a little bit bright, a little bit aggressive, but not insane. In fact, I think that Elysian's like Gaia, for example, right? You can check this out if you want on Squiglink. I think the Gaia is tuned a lot more intense than the Pilgrim was at CanJam. But I think they played it a little bit safe. They pulled back the tuning a little bit. And I think that the result is that the production version here of the Pilgrim is a good sounding IM, but it's also kind of like just not special or stand out in any way to my ear. So to illustrate this, let me pull in some other IMs at around this price range, right? These are all around 400 bucks. And I'll talk about how I think this thing sits amongst the group and where it might have sat if it was the version that I heard at CanJam. So here we've got the Thea Audio Hype 4. Here we've got the Yanyan Canon 2, the Moondrop Dusk, the new one with Critical. And then here we've got the Soft Ears Studio 4. So again, all around 400 bucks. In terms of tonal balance, this is kind of where I want to start with, right? I think that the Canon is the warmest, thickest, meatiest, dirtiest of the bunch, the bassiest of the bunch, but it's kind of fun for it. I would say that the Hype 4 is kind of next. It's got, you know, a leaner, more clinical mid-range tune, which is more in line with what these things are tuned like, but the bass on this guy is quite meaty and thick. And then you've got, I would say, the Pilgrim, kind of middle of the pack here in terms of its tonal balance, whereas I would say once you start getting to the Dusk, and I'm listening to it on 3.5 mil, if you're listening to it on DSP cable, can sound different, but in the stock analog form, I would describe this as kind of a lean, clinical, neutral sound with a nice sub-bass boost, vocal forward for sure. And I think that the Pilgrim kind of ends up here. And then the Studio 4, I would say, is, in my opinion, the kind of like the brightest and liveliest of the bunch. The more, yeah, just the most top end. And the least bass, the least warmth, the most clinical sound. So that's kind of the gamut here. If I were comparing this versus the version that I heard at CanJam, I would probably say, you could probably even argue that this was the brightest and the most assertive, I suppose, of the bunch. But I don't know, it was pretty close to honestly where the Studio 4 is. You know, you notice on the graph, it didn't look like that big of a difference, but when you have a bunch of IMs that are all tuned kind of similar, like these are all kind of like neutral with some bass boost, those little differences do make a big difference when it comes to the actual listening impression and the comparison. So that's kind of where it was. This is where it ended up landing in terms of tonal balance, which is right in the middle. Sounds like that might actually be, again, maybe the safer tune that's going to work for more people. Now, in terms of what I actually prefer, I would say that my favorite, maybe no surprise, is going to be the Dusk. I recently reviewed this guy. I gave it 5 stars. That's my favorite on the table here. Next up would honestly probably be a tie between the Studio 4 and the Canon 2. And that's interesting because these are not tuned similar. Again, I thought these were like on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the tonal balance. But when it comes to what I actually end up liking and listening to, I like them both for different reasons. I think the imaging is just really fantastic. The vocal transparency on the Studio 4 is fantastic. Texturing, maybe not the best, and the bass is okay. And then the Canon is just like the opposite. Like the bass on this thing is so sturdy, so thick, so meaty, and really well done. But it also does still a good job of preserving the top end texturing. So I'm pretty surprisingly impressed by the Canon 2. And then after that, I would say it's probably the Hype, and then probably the Pilgrim. I think the Hype is got the more exciting bass presentation versus the Pilgrim, and it's got the more exciting wider stereo image. Whereas the Pilgrim's imaging is good. It's certainly not bad, but it doesn't have quite that same separation and distinction between instruments that I think the Hype 4 does better. Now, here's what's interesting. If we were to go back to that version that I heard at CanJam, this is not the order I would put them in. I would probably swap these two around. In fact, it probably honestly would compete with these three. Again, kind of different strengths, but the high frequency percussion on this guy was just standout. Like, I haven't heard anything that good below like $1,500. Really standout high frequency percussion. Now, unfortunately, the version that we get here in production, it's just been nerfed a little bit. And again, I think it's like the safer tune, but it also ends up being, I don't know, to me, just less engaging, less exciting. And it's not because like necessarily it was just the brighter tune. As we saw, like, this is the warmest, thickest tune, and I find this really satisfying in a way. But this one just kind of ended up a little bit middle of the road. So I think that is going to do it for my thoughts here on the Elysian Acoustic Labs Pilgrim. Out of 5 stars, I'll give it 3 stars. This is definitely not a bad IEM. This is still a very solid IEM. It's just that this price range, $400, has gotten pretty competitive. And if this had shipped the way that I heard at CanJam, well, I think this would be actually more competitive. Personally, I can understand why some people would prefer this tuning because it is more balanced, a little bit safer of a tune, but it's also just, because of that, ends up being a little bit middle of the road. And that is, I don't know, kind of how I feel about the Pilgrim. If you want to check it out, I got it linked down below. Shout out again to Hi-Fi Go for sending this guy in. But yeah, while you're down there, if you haven't already, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit.